the title of this lecture is Good Sources of Drug Use Data. I put that in good because there's a lot of sources of drug use data out there, but a lot of them are really misleading and not very good. So the purpose of this lecture is to actually introduce the students to find out how many Americans use drugs, particular drugs, and the methodological issues in drug research. You can think of this lecture as a companion to the lectures titled Types of Drugs and Modes of Ingestion and Drugs Usage Rates. One of those other lectures basically explains how drugs are ingested and the basic classifications of drugs, such as depressants, stimulants, etc. And the other one, Drugs and Drug Usage Rates, looks at the various drugs used to get high, the ways they are ingested, and a bit about their extent of use in U.S. society. Okay, next. The purpose of this lecture is to introduce the student to find out how many Americans are actually using a particular drug so that you can ignore the media hype. Actually, the more accurate question is what percentage of Americans use a various drug in the year. So what percentage of Americans used ice or marijuana in the past year is a better number than how many. Rates are the same things as a percentage. They're just expressed differently. So usually you'll see a rate like some number per 100,000 U.S. residents used ice or marijuana in the last year, or you'll see a percentage. Same thing. Raw numbers, how many Americans are useless because they're subject to population changes. As your population grows, then the raw number grows. So that's not a very useful statistic. And as I said earlier, this drug is a companion to two other lectures. I want you to completely ignore the media's coverage of drug use and drugs, and I'm dead serious. There's a couple of reasons why to completely ignore the media. First of all, drug news, actually crime news in general, but drug news is infotainment. Actually, all news nowadays is mostly infotainment and not objective information. This is especially true when it comes to drugs and crime. Secondly, you need to know that the purpose of the news is profit, not objective information. Almost all the sources out there on news are privately owned corporations designed to make money. That's basically what they're designed to do. And the more people that they can get to read their magazine or newspaper, or the more people they can get to tune in to their news broadcast, the more money they make. So they like scary stories because people will tune in. What I want to remind you is that reporters are good people at putting in an impossible situation. I don't say that reporters are out there to consciously mislead people. Essentially, what they have to do is if they're lucky, they have a few hours to write up a story or to go do a story on the television news. If they're extraordinarily lucky in written coverage or even on the news, on the TV, their producer or editor will give them a few days to do a study. But some of the problems with media information about drugs is that they use a few cases. They go and talk to maybe 3 people who are ice users, and then they extrapolate and they try to say that these 3 people are representative of all people who use a particular drug. You can't do that. 3 people are never going to be representative. And they get them very quickly. They don't use social science methodology to find those cases. They also use expert opinions of people like me with fancy backgrounds. So they might just ask me, Dr. Hallstone, how bad is the ice problem? And if you saw me, I would most typically, in a professor's office, I would, on the mainland, I'd be wearing a tie, of course. And in the back would be a bunch of books, which give me the notion that I'm well read, or that background creates part of the message, if you will. You notice when you ever see scientists or doctors, medical doctors. Usually they have a lab coat on, and typically you'll see them in the background. There's a lab with things bubbling, and that background is part of the message, that these people know what they're talking about. So they'll ask expert opinions, and that it's fact that it's somebody's opinion, but it's not. Somebody's opinion is not necessarily accurate. They also will always find an extreme example of a drug user, and they'll present that as the normal case. So they'll, for example, find somebody who's lost everything on ice or cocaine, and that will be presented as sort of the normal or typical case. And then lastly, in the television media, basically they get 8-second sound bites when they speak to people, and in the written media they have very short quotes. So if you want to know the extent of a drug problem in the United States, what you need to do is you can watch the media, but watch or read the media, but treat it as infotainment, because that's what it is. It's most frankly scare tactics and misleading. Why is it scary? Because that'll get you to tune in or read their paper, and then they can make more money. Okay, academia is the best source of drug use information. Please excuse me, I have to take a couple drinks of water when I talk continuously like this. While it's not perfect, academic information is the best source of accurate information about the extent of drug use in our society. The two major studies that I'm going to suggest are the best ones are government-funded studies, but they're done by academics, and they're using sound academic principles. And these people are social scientists, and they follow rules that help them gather objective information about the social world. Unlike the media, they're held to a higher standard of how they gather their information, which we know, using mathematical principles, etc., are indeed accurate to a certain extent. Now, social science information is not perfect, and as you'll see, some of the information about drugs is problematic in some regard, but it is far better than philosophizing under the coconut tree. What I mean by that is just using your biased opinion to describe drug use. Just thinking about it, like you and I are pretty intelligent people. We could just sit around and go, "Hey, Mike, what do you think? How many people use ice?" I could go, I think this many. To just give you an example, one time when I was teaching at Arizona State, I presented some statistics on the extent of marijuana use in the United States, and this one girl walked up to me and she goes, "Those stats have to be biased." I go, "Why?" She goes, "Because everybody I know is smoking pot." So that's the difference between somebody's biased opinion sitting under the coconut tree and thinking you could accurately describe the social world on your own, and using science, if you will. The next few slides are taken from another lecture, but I've added new audio, but they apply here. And we're going to learn a little bit about how, if you wanted to learn how many people are using, what percentage of Americans are using drugs, how you go about doing that. Okay. Traditional social science works by things called samples and population. There are rules or assumptions for collecting the data. Social science and science in general studies the world by taking samples from population and hoping that the sample is representative of the population. So essentially, in the example of drug use, you want to know for the perhaps everybody living in Hawaii, age 12 and over, what percentage of them are using ice. That would be your population. But you obviously couldn't speak to every single person who uses ice, so you speak to a sample of that population. We'll get into this more in the other slides. But what I do want you to know is that its sampling is incredibly complex and it's incredibly accurate. Believe it or not, social scientists using really good sampling methodology are able to accurately represent all U.S. voters with a sample of a couple thousand. So think about all U.S. voters who are registered. That's a huge population. It's got to be in the millions. But they have their technology down, their methodology down to the point where they can, within a few percentage points, very accurately figure out how all U.S. voters feel about a particular issue or candidate. That's why, if you can remember back, they got the news people to stop projecting winners until all the polls had closed on election day coverage on the TV. Next slide. Okay, so here's a little graphic. So you have a population. Okay, that population is the group of people or things that you want to study. It's made up of something called sampling elements. In our case, they would most likely be individual drug users, because we want to figure out, about drug use. So the sample is a subset or a portion of the population. So that's why that's a little bit smaller circle. So you can't speak to everybody in the population, so what you do is you speak to a smaller portion of it. That's called a sample. And then we take that data from the sample and we infer from the sample back to the population. So in essence, what we do is we hope that the sample is representative of the population. And there are basic mathematical rules that allow us to do that with certain levels of confidence. Okay, give you some formal definitions of population and samples. A researcher decides on the group of people she wishes to study. This group is called a population. It is an intellectual act. It's up to the researcher to define their population. Okay, and you'll see a little bit more how they define their populations when we study. When I say I'm going to tell you what percentage of Americans use marijuana, I'll tell you how the population is defined, if you will. But a more formal definition of a population, if this helps you, is a quote there: a complete collection of measurements, objects, or individuals under study. Again, what the researcher does is they study a portion or a subset taken from that population, which is called a sample. Okay, the researcher defines the population she wishes to study. This is an intellectual act, so all researchers on their own decide how to define the population they wish to study. Okay, let's go to some definitions if we can. A population is made up of sampling elements. Okay, sampling elements are the exact thing the researcher wishes to study. In the social sciences, most of the time it's individual people, but it could be, if you wanted to study which kinds of drug treatment programs work, you might study actual drug treatment programs, which are not people but are programs. It's the exact unit of analysis, if you will, the sampling element. For example, we have a professor named Dr. Mobley here at University of Hawaii, West Oahu, and he studies whales. So I would imagine when he flies around and looks for whales in his airplane, his sampling elements are individual whales or maybe pods of whales. Okay, so back to the plot here. What we do is we select a number of the sampling elements from the population. We study them. That means that becomes our sample. Okay, we study the sample, and we hope that we are representative of the rest of the population. So we infer from the sample to the population. Okay, because we do not study everybody in the population, there's always some error when we infer from the sample of the population. But we can measure that error when we use very good methodology. Next slide. Okay. Inferential statistics are the basis of science. When I just said that we infer from the sample to the population, that's called inferential statistics. And to do that, it requires probability samples with random selection. Okay, let me kind of tell you what that means in plain English. Remember that we study a sample from the population and we infer from that sample to the population. We hope that that sample is representative of the population. Okay? Now, that representativeness, that inferring, that's inferential statistic. That's the basis of the vast majority of modern science. Okay? In order to use inferential statistics to be able to make mathematical probabilities of how accurate you may or may not be with your data, you require something called a probability sample with random selection. You may have heard another term, a generic term that's not exactly correct, you've probably heard of, is a random sample. So inferential statistics require a random sample. That's not the correct terminology, but that might be something that you've heard of. Next slide. Okay, again, a picture for you. We have a population made up of sampling elements. We randomly select from that population people to be in our sample. That's a portion or a subset of the population. And then we infer, once we've collected that sample randomly, if you will, we can infer from the sample back to the population using modern statistics, okay, what are called inferential statistics. So the key here is a random sample, if you will, a probability sample. Now let's complicate it a little bit more. Okay, a probability sample, definition of that is that we know in advance the likelihood or the probability that a sampling element from the population will be selected into the sample. Plus, these sampling elements, remember usually they're individual drug users in our case, must be chosen by random selection. Random selection is like bingo or Keno. That means that the researcher has no control over which people from the population are selected. Okay, if you've ever seen bingo, or where they have the balls rotating, I don't know if they still do that in Keno, but what they used to have was balls rotating in this sort of hopper, and they come out randomly. Okay, the person who's spinning that thing, assuming that all the balls are correctly weighted, etc., and the machine is made correctly, they have no control over which balls are come out. I want you to again think, when I say a probability sample, if that's, you can't get your mind around that, think of the notion of a random sample. And that comes from, that term comes from the most basic type of a probability sample called a simple random sample. That example of bingo is a simple random sample. If it's that bingo example, with, it's like putting ping pong balls, and we could write everybody's name on one, and then then they all come out. That's the idea of a simple random sample. Now, just so you know, the really Gucci types of samples, probability samples that we'll be talking about later in these other studies, and when I talked about them being able to very accurately represent all voters with a sample of a couple thousand, do not use the simple random sample. They use very complicated types of probability samples, and we'll leave it at that. Okay. A non-probability sample is we don't know this likelihood or probability in advance of the probability that a particular sampling element will be selected from the population, and or the researcher has some, there is no random selection. The researcher has some control of which people are selected from the population. Just so you know, almost every single student project I've ever ran across will use a non-probability sample. They're not useless, okay, but you need to understand their limitations. Technically speaking, if you have a non-probability sample, you're not supposed to use inferential statistics. Okay, now, to have a good random sample, if you will, that depends on having a sampling frame that's representative of the population. So good probability samples depend on having something called a sampling frame that's representative of the population. Okay, a sampling frame is something like when we make a list that operationalizes our population and closely approximates all the elements in our population, we've created something called a sampling frame. A sampling frame, pardon me, is the list or the group, if you will, from which I will pick people to be in my study. Okay, so I need some sort of a list or a sampling frame. Now, having a good probability sample is dependent on a good match between the sampling frame and the population. So what you need is you need a sampling frame that's very close, if you could, perfectly representative of the population, which is, again, made up of sampling elements. Here's the key. For drug research, it's very difficult to find a sampling frame for any deviant population, such as drug users. I'm going to give you some other examples in some other slides to come, but if you think about it, there is no list of all drug users out there. Okay, so there is no list of all car thieves out there. There is no list of all surfers out there. That's not that surfers are very deviant, but for some populations, it's very difficult to come up with a good sampling frame. That's especially true for deviant populations, and that's what we're talking about with drug users. But don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just because I'm going to show you some examples, you're going to say, wow, that sampling frame isn't perfect. Yeah, but it's better than us sitting under the coconut tree. It's a lot better. Okay, so it's not perfect, but don't go the other way and go, oh, see, science genius statistics say anything. Don't go there. Okay? They're not perfect, but they're a whole lot better than the media or you and I sitting there trying to figure it out on our own. Okay, remember, a good random sample, if you will, is dependent on a good match between your actual population, that's the group that you wish to study, and your sampling frame. Okay, that's the list of people from which you're going to, excuse me, draw people to be in your sample. I can think of a few perfect matches. They're hard to find for crime. Then there's hardly any perfect matches between sampling frames and populations for deviant populations, but I can think of some perfect ones. Registered voters. If that was my population I wanted to study, there's a perfect match. There's a voter registration list. That's the sample. That would be the sampling frame. So if I wanted to study registered voters, I take the registered voter list and I randomly select people from that list. Okay, that's why they're able to do, by the way, so accurately represent voters, is because there isn't a perfect match out there with registered voters. By the way, if you're not a registered voter, politicians don't care what you think. That's why you're never mind. Getting off the track there, just trying to encourage you folks to become active participants in your democracy. Okay, another perfect example would be if I wanted to study UH students as my population, I should say registered UH students, there's a perfect sampling frame, and that's registered student records. By the way, you as a student, even me as a professor, due to privacy concerns, would probably never get that list from the UH bureaucracy, but you get the idea. That's a perfect match. If you wanted to, if registered students were your population, then we know that there's a record of registered students somewhere, so that would be a perfect sampling frame. There are also pretty good matches. Imagine you wanted to use phones to reach homeowners. Phones to reach voters wouldn't be bad. Phones to reach taxpayers. In each of these cases, you assume something called random digit dialing, which is nothing other than the computer randomly sort of put in the prefixes, and then the computer randomly dials the last four numbers, and that way you're able to get listed and unlisted numbers. But the idea here is that most homeowners have phones. Getting a little less likely with cell phones nowadays, but just pretend landline phones. Most voters have phones. Most taxpayers have phones. So that's a pretty good match. So phones would be a pretty good sampling frame for those populations. Now let me give you some fairly bad matches. What if I wanted to use phones to reach any poor population, such as uninsured women in need of prenatal care? Phones wouldn't be a very good match for somebody who's poor by definition. The homeless is sort of almost a perfect example of a bad match, although I live in Macau, so I see plenty of people who are obviously poor who have cell phones nowadays, but you get the example, I hope. Imagine if I wanted to use court records of convicted car thieves to reach all car thieves. So I want all car thieves as my population, and I'm going to use a list of convicted car thieves from the courts. Why is that bad? Well, maybe the ones who get caught and convicted are the really bad ones, the really stupid ones. I like to say that one of the reasons why you're never going to punish your way out of drugs is that only fairly, I don't want to say stupid drug dealers get caught. I mean, people who stand out on the corner and deal drugs, that's not necessarily that they're stupid. That's kind of just like, that's just the way, that's not necessarily stupid. But in terms of like house drug dealers, all you got, if you don't sell to somebody you don't know, you're not going to get caught. So anyway, using convicted whoever to reach, like for example, using people convicted of drug possession to reach a population of drug users is not a good idea. It's a bad match. Another bad match is treatment populations to reach drug users. You say, hey, I want to study all alcoholics. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a treatment center. I'm sorry. I want to study alcohol users, not alcoholics. I said alcoholics. I want to study alcohol users. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a treatment center for people with alcohol problems, and I'm going to use that as my sampling frame. Well, that's really bad because by definition, people in treatment are extreme drug users. By definition, they've got totally unmanageable drug or alcohol problems. Another bad match is to use phones to reach all victims of crime. It's a pretty good way, if you've taken one of my other classes, it is really the best way, in a way, to measure victims of crime, but marginalized populations, people living on the street without phones, we know are actually victimized at a higher rate. So when you just use phones to reach victims of all crime, you underestimate it to a certain and unknown extent. So back to the plot. To have a good probability sample and use inferential statistics and make a mathematical statement, I'm this confident that there's this percentage of people using marijuana in the U.S., you need to find a good match between your population and your sampling frame. Let me give you some traditional problems with drug research, if you will. Because of the problems of coming up with the probability sample of drug users, if you might think about it, if I asked you to think of a sampling frame for drug users, it's pretty hard to come up with one. For convenience, most drug research has traditionally used samples, i.e. sampling frames from treatment, criminal, and college populations. Now, each of these are problematic in that they're not representative of the general population of drug users. As I said earlier, treatment populations. Why are they not representative of the general population of drug users? Because the vast majority of people in treatment are, by definition, have the most problematic and extreme. They are the most problematic and extreme drug users. These are not people, for example, who have 1 or 2 cocktails a day. These are people who, once they start drinking, they can't stop drinking. Or they stop smoking pot, smoking ice, whatever. So using treatment, unless you wanted to study just problematic users, treatment populations is a decent sampling frame. However, just so you know, we do know that a very large proportion of people with even problematic drug problems, that's what happens when you make an online lecture. I apologize. Anyway, a large number of people with drug problems are able to quit using drugs without using a formal treatment regimen. Other drug researchers use criminal populations. The problem here for using a criminal population as the basis of a sampling frame is that they're very similar to treatment populations as they're biased towards extreme and problematic drug users. There's something about crime, it's that risky lifestyle, if you will, that using drugs goes along with it. A lot of people make the mistake of saying, well, in some cases it is the drugs that cause the crime, but in the vast majority of cases people start doing crime before they start using drugs. But anyway, they're skewed toward the most extreme problematic drug users. A lot of researchers use college populations as sampling frames. They're not representative of the general population of drug users because by definition they're more educated, they're less ethnically diverse, and they tend to be of higher socioeconomic status. So a lot of traditional drug research have used these sorts of populations as sampling frames, and you can hopefully now see, well, that's kind of problematic. Doesn't mean it's useless information, but you need to be a critical consumer and find out, okay, what sampling frame did they use, and that should give you an idea of whether it's, the quality of the data that comes out of it. Next. Okay, there are two nationally representative surveys. What I mean by that is they are two federally funded studies that attempt to make estimates of drug use in the general U.S. population. There are some in Europe too, but these are the only two in the U.S. One is called Monitoring the Future. This is basically a study of kids in high school. It annually collects information about drug use, demographics, and lifestyle from a nationally representative sample of high school seniors and has conducted follow-up interviews with a subset of each graduating class since 1976. I have a site for you there. It also has some information about 8th and 10th graders too, and it is a survey that's done in class, so they take it in class and they ask them questions. One of its benefits is that it doesn't just ask about drug use, it asks other things like how available are drugs. It also has, some years it'll ask them about different various lifestyle things. But just from that description, I hope your critical mind is starting to say, I see some problems there. Sort of the sampling frame are people who are in class on a certain day, even though they probably randomly select the schools and the classes. The other study is now called the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, and I gave you a little acronym there. It used to be called the National Household Survey of Drug Abuse. I'm not sure why they changed the name. This survey collects information about the drug use of the U.S. household population aged 12 and older. U.S. household population aged 12 and older. Households can be defined very loosely. People in apartments are included, if you will. Right there, I'm going to argue that this national, I'll call it the National Household Survey, if you will, is better than MTF, Monitoring the Future. But I hope that just from that information there, your critical mind starts to say, Okay. But the questions include age at first use, whether they've ever used a particular drug in their lifetime, whether they've used a particular drug in the past year and the past month. They ask them about a whole bunch of drugs: marijuana, cocaine, crack, hallucinogens, heroin, inhalants, alcohol, tobacco, non-medical use of prescription drugs. They even ask about methamphetamine. It kind of changes, They ask about ecstasy now, since ecstasy's come around. They also ask a little bit about personal and family income, their sources and amounts, a little bit about substance abuse history. Kind of depends which year the study. Different studies have different things, but essentially they're asking about, have you ever used a particular drug ever in your life, in the past year, but not in the past month, and then the past month. If you say yes to the past month, they ask you how many days out of the past month. Okay, there are problems with these surveys, as you might imagine already. I want to reiterate, though, that these national surveys provide good basic information about the extent of drug use in general. Which of these studies you would use would depend on which population you're interested. Basically, if you're interested in kids in high school, you would probably tend to use MTF, monitoring the future. However, if you think about it, theoretically, the household survey would cover the monitoring the future sampling frame too. Monitoring the future sampling frame is high school seniors, right? But the National Household Survey is the U.S. household population age 12 and older. So if you think about it, that's even actually it's a better sampling frame. Why? First of all, it's an in-class survey about high school seniors. Okay, so think about it, if you would, for a moment. Where I went to high school, the druggies were ditching class, so they wouldn't be in class for the survey if they were a druggie. They were out getting high, or the really serious ones that maybe even had dropped out already. So the problems of it doing in class are not so bad as that, well, they tell the truth in class, because I'm pretty sure that they ask the teachers to leave, and they take confidentiality precautions and whatnot. But the major problem is that the real serious druggies are more likely not to be in class or to have dropped out, if you will. So if you think about that, the National Household Survey is a little bit better, because it would at least get those, assuming they lived in a household age 12 and older, it would get those druggies who had already dropped out. So in that sense, it's a little bit better survey in general than the monitoring the future. In general, okay, that's a very accurate statement. But again, the problems with the household survey are similar. It's age 12 and older. You may argue that there are a significant amount of drug users that are under the age of 12. If you look at the data, there's not a lot of 12-year-olds using any substance, so it doesn't seem to suggest that. But even in my own study on drug use, I ran into people who'd use drugs very, very early in their lives. So that could be one criticism of it. The better criticism of it is that it uses the household population. Prior to 1991, the sampling frames for I'll call it the household survey because I can never remember the new name for it. It excluded Alaska and Hawaii. It now includes it, but they're very small samples of Alaska and Hawaii. And they excluded populations such as those residing in institution, i.e. prisons, jails, mental health facilities, military barracks, college dormitories, social service, housing, homeless, and other marginalized people. So it kind of makes sense, right? If you're not living in a house or an apartment, you're not part of the sampling frame, so you're not going to be included in the sample. So you could make the argument that people who aren't living in houses or apartments or whatever are more likely to have more extreme drug problems, and you're going to miss them. And that's absolutely true. But since 1991, it has included college dormitories, homeless shelters, and some other group quarters, civilians living on military bases. But it's actually, but even by doing that, it's had very little impact on the national estimates, believe it or not. So, despite the changes in this household survey, it does systematically miss important drug-using populations, such as high school dropouts, that would be MTF, people living on the streets in either case, or other transient populations such as prostitutes, street addicts, hustlers, or others sort of existing on the grid. And, like I said, ethnographic, I didn't actually say this, but ethnographic research has demonstrated that drug use tends to be more extreme in some of these marginalized populations, just like you would think. So therefore, even though they're based on random sampling and are representative of the vast majority of Americans, especially the household survey, these surveys do systematically admit a small but very important segment of the drug-taking population. So, as I will show you, the national survey data make it difficult to draw conclusions about more extreme forms of drug taking. First of all, these ethnographic research, that's basically when you go and you talk story with people, has clearly demonstrated that drug-taking behaviors are far more diverse and complex than assumed by the national surveys. And the more debilitating effects of drug use tend to surface at more extreme levels. Okay, remember, in each of these surveys, basically all you can find out is, have you ever used a drug? Have you used a drug in the past year, but not in the past month? And then, have you used a particular drug in the past month? And then they ask you how many days out of the past month. So the most precise level of information we get from these surveys is how many days out of the month a particular person has used a certain substance. So it's actually, they don't report the number of days of the month. I'll tell you in a second. But just as an example, it's one thing to know a number, to say that you've used a particular drug, say 10 days out of the last month. It's quite another to know why you've used that particular drug or in what context. Okay, why a person uses drugs is important. The context in which they use drugs is important. Is it socially? Is it to escape their problems, etc.? Allow me an example. Even daily use. Not all daily users are the same, and they can be very different types of drug users. Let me give you an example. My Uncle Gary gets up in the morning very early. He goes and exercises. He makes himself a breakfast. He comes back, makes breakfast. Will smoke one cigarette. Goes out, buys. He's retired now. Goes out, buys food for lunch. Makes himself a very small, reasonable lunch. With lunch, he has a beer or a glass of wine, depending on what he's eating, to complement the taste. So now he's had one drink. Then after he washes the dishes and cleans up, he has a cigar after lunch with a very small amount of chocolate. I eat the whole damn bar, and this guy nibbles on a little teeny amount. And he has some espresso, and he has some brandy with it. Usually he has about a shot at lunch. So that's 2 drinks. Then at dinner, before dinner, when his wife comes home from work at about 4 p.m., he has a cocktail with his wife. Sometimes he shares a cocktail with her. So that's a half, but let's just pretend he has a whole one. So that's 3. Then at dinner, he'll have, again, a beer or a glass of wine, depending on what he's eating. I have seen him have 2. So now we're up to maybe, very rarely though, so now we're up to 4. Maybe 5, okay? But we're talking out, they're very spread out. Then his wife does the dishes. He goes again, has his cigar, his little bit of chocolate or his little sweet, his espresso, and his brandy. Now, I have seen him have maybe 2 shots. Maybe if he's really happy to see me because he hasn't seen me in a while. Maybe 3, but I doubt it. So he's maybe having about 5 to 6 drinks a day. Now, compare Uncle Gary to somebody who comes home at 5 o'clock and pounds 5 to 6 drinks right in a row. Uncle Gary claims he hardly really even gets drunk. He just uses to complement the tastes of things. So I would argue that the example of my Uncle Gary, you could say he has a problem if you want. But you compare him to somebody who comes home and has 5 or 6 beers right in a row, I would say they're both daily users, but they're not the same type of alcohol users. So, what if you, give me another example, what if you had a single cocktail every day prior to dinner and one glass of wine with dinner? Would you say that person has a significant drinking problem? Of course, one could define this as problematic, but I doubt anybody would say this is a serious, debilitating drinking problem, meaning one that would cause severe problems in one's life. Now, if you drank yourself into oblivion every evening, then I think most reasonable people would say you have a serious problem that's likely to cause significant problems in your life. And your problem would be even worse if you drank all day long. So I truly believe I have reasonably described different types of drinking patterns here. Okay, so not all daily users are the same. Same thing can be applied to illicit drugs. It's one thing to take a couple of puffs of marijuana every day after work or something like that. It's quite another story to smoke all day and all night long, or every day and all night long. Okay, the analogy starts to stretch when we talk about harder drugs, but the general idea is applicable. There's a significant difference between using a small amount once a day and using a large amount every day, be it all day long or at one sitting. They're different types of drug users. So there's a continuum of drug use patterns, and the problems that start to become more serious and numerous as use increases. But all we know from these national surveys is that you've used daily. Now, here's a problem with this definition of daily. If you agree that these hypothetical examples of mine describe very different types of drug users, then we find yourself in a quandary with these national surveys. Each of these drug users would be lumped into the same category, daily users. Get this, actually daily use is defined by these surveys as 20 or more days in a month. They actually have the raw data, meaning the exact number of days between 1 and 30, but daily use is defined, like I said, 20 or more days a month. That's only 2/3 of the days. So that makes no sense to me personally. If daily to me means every day, not 2/3 of the days. You know, and I can say, well, you know, you're a daily user, but you maybe skip a few days, but not a whole third of them. Daily to me means almost every day. So in my opinion, this is sort of another example of the federal government manipulating definitions of good data to create scare tactics. Think about it. How are you going to have more daily users? If you define daily use as 20 more days of a month, or if you had to define daily use of all the days in the month? Which definition will have more daily users? Duh, 20 or more days. So you got to sort of search in these reports to find the actual number of days, but the things that they send out to the media are daily use, defined as 20 days a month. Okay, next slide. So now what? Basically, if you need these household surveys, if you will, in MTF are useful. Okay. But in the absence of absolutely immense sums of money to conduct more detailed nationally representative data, we as informed drug or crime or deviance researchers are sort of left in a quandary. I already kind of mentioned the pros and cons of the national surveys. We can't really get at the really extreme drug users are missed. All we can get down is, did you use every day? And I've already made an argument that there's different types of daily drug users. One drink a day, you'd be called a daily alcohol user. One puff of marijuana, you'd be called a daily marijuana user. So one way to get that some of this important contextual information that I've been talking about that is missed in these national surveys is ethnography. Basically, the idea here is that the researcher immerses him or herself, in more or less degrees of this, by the way, in another way or life or culture, in an attempt to not only record or describe their behavior, but understand the symbolic meanings of that culture. So an ethnographer would sort of want to learn, what does it mean to share aloha? What does it mean to get high on drugs? What is meant by, I want to share my mana with you, mana'o. What is meant by cruising? What we're doing today, I was just cruising. What's meant by hanging? If you ask me what did I do last weekend, and I replied, I just chilled. Most of you in this room would know exactly what I meant. You know the meaning behind chill. Somebody from Japan or Turkey or even my grandma might not have any idea what that meant. What do you mean you chilled, honey? Did you go out in the cold? Okay. So ethnography allows us to get a deeper level of knowledge about drug users. There's explicit knowledge. That's a type of cultural knowledge. So if you knew behaviorally what I did when I said I chilled, then you have explicit knowledge about what chilling means. So you would know, well, he didn't do a whole lot. That's knowledge of the behavior. Tacit knowledge is a deeper type. Not only do you know what I did behaviorally by chilling, you know the ethos behind it. You know the meaning behind it. It's like I didn't take anything too seriously. I didn't worry about my responsibilities. There was no specific purpose to what I was doing. I was just sort of taking care of myself. So if you understood that, then you actually have tacit knowledge about chilling. So tacit knowledge is understanding the symbolic meanings attached to the behavioral expectations, norms, etc. You know what's really going on. So similar things can be said about drug use. What does tweaking mean or jonesing mean? What's a bad trip? What is a tweaker, a strawberry, a chicken head, a crackhead, a dope fiend, a righteous dope fiend? So ethnography seeks to understand drug use from the perspective of those who actually use drugs. And although ethnography can use quantitative or number data, it primarily uses qualitative or stories. And that qualitative story stuff is good because it gives us the context. We learn what the life of a drug user is like. Of course, ethnography isn't perfect either. The vast majority of ethnography is not based upon random sampling. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, it's extremely difficult and expensive to get a random sample of a deviant population like drug users. The reason why MTF and that other National Household Survey is funded by the federal government is because it's incredibly expensive. So, you know, if I had a ton of money, I would love to do some ethnography with really, really, really good random samples. But that would take an incredible amount of money. So another problem with ethnography is that it's tend to be done on populations that are more extreme drug users, and those basically the kind of people who you see on the nightly news. They're truly down and out street addict. Why? One reason is that they're easy to find. Another reason is that, well, if you were interested in problematic drug use only, these people clearly have problems. But there are doctors and lawyers who are problematic drug users too. But if you think about it, lawyers and doctors and politicians and people who use drugs are very difficult to locate. And even if you can locate them, why in the heck should they talk to you in a drug researcher in today's day and age? Drug researchers are absolutely, you know, held by ethical standards that you would never reveal names, you don't collect names, etc. But why the heck, what do they have in it to talk to you? They have much more to lose than to gain, even though scientists is required to keep things anonymous. But really, really heavy drug addicts are much easier to find, so a lot of ethnography is focused on them. Just go to Chinatown in Honolulu or whatever your local version is of Skid Row where the street addicts hang out. I see addicts on Hotel Street all the time, so they're easy to locate of a city in any size, so that's kind of why ethnography tends to be based on those people. So in that sense, ethnography, we get context, but unfortunately, in general, it tends to focus on really extreme drug users. So what I say is that what you should do is sort of combine the information, synthesize the information from the national level studies and the ethnographic studies, and that gives you the most complete possible view that's possible. So it's imperfect, yes, but it's an attempt, if you use them together, to provide an accurate picture of drug use in the U.S. It's imperfect, yes, but it would be a mistake to say that science is truly useless or a waste of time. Certainly we can get a better picture of the extent of drug use in this way than merely sitting under the coconut tree and philosophizing. Okay, so that concludes this